With many different parties affected by corporate decision-making and its consequences, we have to often struggle with the question of exactly whose interests ought to be prioritized when we're allocating firm resources. Importantly, one of the major issues that arises is how conflicts of interest between these various groups ought to be addressed. In many cases, various stakeholder groups of the organization, i.e., parties who are affected by its decision-making, are usually protected through the right to appoint firms' directors, but they may also benefit from having legal protections in place, things like labor laws or environmental laws, claims to seniority in the event of a firm bankruptcy. All of these effectively act to try to protect the interests of various parties who have contributed resources to the organization or who face consequences from its poor allocational decisions. What we'll be looking at next are different techniques for addressing these sorts of problems, often through the assignment of board seats, but not exclusively. In general, each type of governance systems offers different advantages and different disadvantages that are worth exploring in detail, so that we might try to understand how different types of models are used to address different kinds of challenges. Overall, however, affiliation remains the secret sauce of organizational success, effectively helping to reduce conflicts of interest and enabling people to more readily submit their own interests to those of the collective. And this means that many firms will try to establish a sense of affiliation among their workers, for instance, or among other parties like managers and internal stakeholders through things like corporate culture or profit-sharing programs, internal town halls, and sometimes even broad community engagement. Now, the first type of governance I'd like to consider are those of private family-owned enterprises. These are important to consider because private family-owned enterprises still form an important component of our corporate mix in society today. Families generally come with their own internal allocational and dispute resolution systems, even if they are unofficial and arbitrary. And this allows for family authority and hierarchy to effectively substitute for a contractual relationship between the various parties. Furthermore, genetic bonds of association help to limit concepts like free riding or conflicts that emerge in the case of agency problems. As you might imagine, this type of freely existing structure that predates the existence of the firm is often piggybacked on by burgeoning corporations and companies. And this has resulted in a number of family-owned enterprises existing from time immemorial. In fact, long before entrepreneurs like A. Nazir would have been selling shares to financiers, people would have been training their own children to take over and manage their business enterprises. In fact, before the era of public education, it was customary for families to train their children in the family craft. Now, of course, the argument for creating value by free riding effectively on the family's pre-existing authority structure rests on the assumption that the relationships in the family are in fact healthy and that relatives share an incentive to sustain the firm. In practice, however, we often find that the issue is more complicated than that, with nepotism dominating appointments, private conflicts spilling over into professional life, and control feuds within families paralyzing profitable enterprises, as was seen in the case of McCain for several years. Now, the biggest challenge that family firms face at the end of the day is succession planning. In a broad public corporation, there is a regular churn over who the executives and directors are, and they are appointed at times which don't necessarily follow a human life cycle. But when you're dealing with family-owned enterprises, usually the patriarch or matriarch of the family ends up with an important position within the firm. And this leads to a generational succession that has to be carefully managed. In fact, it's been noted by researchers that fewer than 5% of family firms continue to create value for their owners after the third generation. And there's a number of reasons for this so-called third generation curse. But in general, children might not have any interest in sustaining the enterprise, nor might they have the skills to actually manage it. Among those firms that do survive past the third generation and continue to create value for their family owners, research has suggested that the keys to those success was in fact good corporate governance, a sense of ownership among the family as opposed to simply a sense that there was a checkbook available to them, a commitment to the founders' values that enabled the corporation to grow and flourish in the first place, and checks and balances on their own influence within the corporation. That might seem counterintuitive at first, but being able to prevent family conflicts from bleeding over into organizational conflicts is a major source of value creation. So, in effect, what we need are speed bumps to prevent family conflicts from bleeding over into organizational challenges. Now, one of the most famous family businesses that I'd like to discuss briefly were the Medici, who were famous Italian bankers based in Florence. They originally started off as more like gangsters in the markets of the city, but within the 100 years of the 15th century rose to be particularly prominent in Florentine society, ultimately ending up as the city's de facto rulers by midpoint through that century, and later becoming Grand Dukes of Tuscany. At least more, what is it? Two different queens of France were Medicis. They had at least two different popes. And so you might argue that the family enterprise became internationally diversified and moved away from pure business concerns. But nonetheless, just looking at the first century of the Medici's family business, which was ultimately focused on banking and the processing of wool imports from Northern Europe, is particularly revealing about the pattern that is reinforced in the third generation curse. So beginning in 1397, Giovanni de' Medici established a bank in the same sort of model that the Peruzzi, Bardi, Riccardi families had before him, but with three important changes to the way that Florentine banking had been conducted in the prior century. There would be separate branches operated in each country, meaning that they had their own independent capitalization. None of these branches was to lend to any nobles or sovereigns for fear of their default risk, and no managers were going to be paid fixed salaries. They would only benefit from equity participation in their local operations instead. So this led to significant changes in how successful the firm happened to be. Whereas prior banking families had motivated their employees simply through efficiency wages, high salaries, what the Medici did was encourage their managers to grow the business instead of just caring about preserving it over time. And this kind of equity participation has grown to be a very popular form of alignment of interests between directors, managers, and shareholders, even in the modern world. Its next leader, though, Cosimo de' Medici, was a particularly savvy operator who was able to massively multiply the family fortune during his time as leader of the bank. During this period, in addition to being a particularly savvy banker, Cosimo also engaged in very expensive displays of what would be called in France noblesse oblige, effectively providing for the citizenry due to the benefits that had been gained as a result of their participation in Florentine society. In this example, we see that Cosimo engaged in massive patronage of the arts, and most of the early Renaissance grand masters in terms of painting were in fact bankrolled and paid for by the patronage of the Medici. Anyone who has visited their gallery, the Uffizi in Florence, can tell you about the collection of masterworks that the family's banking success ultimately paid for. The kinds of money that were spent on art and public displays of the family's success totaled in the range of 600,000 ducats, which was about 3 times the size of the entire family fortune when Cosimo first took over the company in 1429. Similarly, rather than just paying money to artists to beautify the city or to engage in cover operations with the Vatican by providing them with art, the Medici also provided very high salaries to their workers, notably paying as much as double the kinds of wages that would have been paid to workers operating in similar nearby towns like Pisa. Unfortunately for the Medici family, the third generation caused some problems. Its next leader, Lorenzo de' Medici, sometimes known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, was far more interested in politics and poetry and art than he was in banking, and as a result provided very poor oversight to the organization. He may have been essential to establishing the family's political presence in the city and throughout Tuscany, but unfortunately, his neglect of the family's business led to substantial problems in some of their more distant offices. Finally, the bank found itself in a very serious financial situation as a result of defaults in its Bruges office, which led to the family's declining financial position. Finally, France invaded northern Italy and Tuscany in 1494. They conquered the city of Florence and seized all of the Medici's assets while they were there. The people of Florence were unable to appreciate what had happened to them. From having been arguably the richest and most influential peoples in Europe, they were suddenly reduced to penury and to vassalage to the French. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, a mob of bankers rose up, a mob in the city rose up, blamed the Medici bankers for the defeat of their city, and burned their palaces to the ground along with most of the family's records. So in this type of situation, we can see what happens in a standard third generation curse. You've got an ambitious founder who works hard to build up the family's position. The children of that founder work hard to sustain this particular legacy, but unfortunately, the third generation is sufficiently removed from the amount of effort required and simply ends up inheriting a great deal of wealth and spends a life enjoying that wealth rather than reinforcing the sources of that wealth. Even though the Medici family ultimately did quite well for themselves in the centuries that followed, the Medici Bank was never restored to prominence. Now, considering the challenges of modern family enterprises, many of them ultimately grew to be sufficiently large that the family was unable to provide the capital necessary to fulfill the full operation. And so they chose to share in the economics of the enterprise with public investors. Nonetheless, most of these families chose to retain operational control over the company, sometimes by giving themselves special shares that had extra voting rights, as was the case with Prada's public offering, or in other cases, they simply create new kinds of governance structures which allow them to achieve the same sort of control objectives while sharing in the economics of the enterprise, as we see in the case of Alibaba. Just like other kinds of firms, though, family-owned firms suffer from the challenges associated with concentrated ownership patterns, which generally results in things like excessive perks, tunneling of profits to privately controlled entities, and the shielding of inefficient managers because people don't want to fire their cousins or brothers, ultimately because they are loyal to the family before they are loyal to the firm. Now, among large firms, the advantages of a family ownership are generally a lot less obvious, suggesting ultimately that this type of ownership pattern may be a bit more about empire building. While there might be opportunities to free ride on the allocational and authority system of the family when the business is relatively small, it's not clear that that family sort of authority structure can be converted to an enterprise with 10 or 20 or 50 or even 100,000 people, despite the platitudes provided by corporate leaders. So rather than risking the firm's survival, what some founders have done is chosen to sunset their privileges through diluting their share ownership, as was the case with Frank Stronach at Magna International. And in other cases, like that of Tata in India, we see that they've actually just turned to extra familial expertise, recognizing that the family does not always have the skills necessary to administer a large multinational enterprise, and that in some cases, calling on a professional cadre of managers may actually lead to better outcomes, both for themselves and for other external stakeholders.